Spiritual Insights. Excerpts from Leo Tolstoy's diary. 1. Have been thinking one thing, that this life which we see around us is a movement of matter according to fixed, well-known laws, but that in us we feel the presence of an altogether different law, having nothing in common with the others and requiring from us the fulfillment of its demands. It can be said that we see and recognize all the other laws only because we have in us this law. If we did not recognize this law, we would not recognize the others. This law is different from all the rest, principally in this, that those other laws are outside of us and forces us to obey them. But this law is in us, and more than in us. It is our very selves, and therefore it does not force us when we obey it, but on the contrary frees us, because in following it, we become ourselves. And for this reason, we are drawn to fulfill this law, and we sooner or later will inevitably fulfill it. In this, then, consists the freedom of the will. This freedom consists in this, that we should recognize that which is, namely, that this inner law is ourselves. This inner law is what we call reason, conscience, love, the good, God. These words have different meanings, but all from different angles mean one and the same thing. In our understanding of this inner law, the Son of God, consists indeed the essence of the Christian doctrine. The world can be looked upon in this way. A world exists governed by certain well-known laws, and within this world are beings subject to the same laws, but who at the same time bear in themselves another law not in accord with the former laws of the world, a higher law, and this law must inevitably triumph within these beings and defeat the lower law. And in this struggle, and in the gradual victory of the higher law over the lower, in this only is life for man and the whole world. 2. I have thought during this time much in meaning. Much of it I could not understand and have forgotten. 1. I have often wanted to suffer, wanted persecution. That means that I was lazy and didn't want to work so that others should work for me, torturing me, and I should only suffer. 2. It is terrible, the perversions of the mind to which men expose children for their own purposes during the time of their education. The rule of conscious materialism is only explained by this. The child is instilled with such nonsense that afterwards the materialistic, limited, false conception, which is not developed to the conclusions which would show its falsity, appears like an enormous conquest of the intellect. 3. I made a note. Violence frees. And it was something very clear and important, and now I don't remember what it was at all. Violence is a temptation because it frees us from the strain of attention, from the work of reasoning. One must labor to undo a knot, to cut it is shorter. 4. A usual perversion of reason, which is made through a violently enforced faith, is to make men satisfied either with idolatry or with materialism, which at bottom is one and the same thing. Faith in the reality of our conceptions is faith in an idol, and the consequences are the same. One must bring sacrifices to it. 5. I can imagine consciousness transferred to the life of the spirit to such a degree that the sufferings of the body would be met gladly. 6. A beautiful woman smiles, and we think that because she smiles, she says something good and true when she smiles. But often, the smile seasons something entirely foul. 7. Education. It is worthwhile occupying oneself with education in order to find out all one's shortcomings. Seeing them, you will begin to correct them. But to correct oneself is indeed the best method of education for one's children and for others and for grown-up people. 8. To love means to desire that which the beloved object desires. The objects of love desire opposing things, and therefore we can only love that which desires one and the same thing. But that which desires one and the same thing is God. 9. Man, beginning to live, loves only himself and separates himself from other beings, in that he constantly loves that which alone constitutes his being. But as soon as he recognizes himself as a separate being, he recognizes also his own love, and he is no longer content with this love for himself, and he begins to love other beings. And the more he lives a conscious life, the greater and greater number of beings he will begin to love, though not with such a stable and unceasing love as that with which he loves himself. But nevertheless, in such a way that he wishes good to everything he loves, and he rejoices at this good, and suffers at the evil which tries the beloved beings, and he unites into one all that he loves. As life is love, why not suppose that my self, that which I consider to be myself and love with a special love, is perhaps the union I made in a former life of things which I loved, just as I am making a union of things now. The other has already taken place, and this one is taking place. Life is the enlargement of love, the widening of its borders, and this widening is going on in various lives. In the present life, this widening appears to me in the form of love. This widening is necessary for my inner life, and it is also necessary for the life of this world. But my life can manifest itself not only in this form. It manifests itself in an innumerable quantity of forms. Only this one is apparent to me. But in the meantime, the movement of life understood by me in this world, through the enlargement of love in myself, and through the union of beings through love, produces at the same time other effects, one or many, unseen by me. As for instance, I put together 8 toy cubes to make a picture on one side of them, not seeing the other sides of the constructed cubes, but on the other sides are being formed pictures just as regular, though unseen by me. 10. I have thought much about God, about the essence of my life, and it seemed I only doubted one and the other and believed in my own conclusions. And then, one time, not long ago, I simply had the desire to lean upon my faith in God and in the indestructibility of my soul, and to my astonishment, I felt so firm and calm a confidence as I have never felt before. So that all my doubts and scrutinizings have evidently not only not weakened my faith, but have strengthened it to an enormous degree. 11. Reason is not given that we should recognize what we ought to love. This it won't disclose, but only for this, to show what we ought not to love. 12. As in each piece of handiwork, the principal art lies not in the regular making of certain things anew, but in the ever-bettering of the inevitable faults of a wrong and ruined work, so even in the business of life, the principal wisdom is not how to begin to act and how to lead life correctly, but how to better faults, how to liberate oneself from errors and seductions. 13. Happiness is the satisfaction of the requirements of a man's being living from birth to death in this world only. But the good is the satisfaction of the requirements of the eternal essence living in man. 14. The essence of the teachings of Christ consists in this, that man ought to know who he is, that he should understand, like a bird which does not use its wings and runs on the land, that he is not a mortal animal dependent on the conditions of the world, but like a bird which has understood that it has wings and has faith in them, he should understand that he himself was never born and never died, and always is, and passes through this world in one of the innumerable forms of life to fulfill the will of him who sent him into this life. 3. 1. I have been thinking especially clearly of that which I have already said many times, that all the evil in the world comes only from this, that people look upon themselves, upon their own personality, as a worthy object of their conscious life. Upon themselves or upon a group of personalities, it is all the same. As long as a man lives for himself unconsciously, he does no harm. If there is a struggle, then the struggle is an unconscious one, which is ended at once when the struggle with surroundings is ended. Man adjusts himself to it, or he goes under, and this struggle is neither cruel nor is it an evil one. The struggle begins to be cruel only when man directs his consciousness upon it, prepares it, strengthens and multiplies its energy tenfold and hundredfold. As Pascal says, there are three kinds of people. One kind know nothing and sit quietly, and just as quiet are those who know. But there are a middle kind who don't know but believe they do. From them comes all the evil in the world. They are the people in whom consciousness has awakened, but they don't know how to use it. 2. The whole thing lies in this, that you should always remember who you are. There is no situation so difficult from which the way out would not immediately offer itself if you only would remember that you are not a temporary material manifestation, but an eternal omnipresent being. I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me shall never die, and though he were dead, yet shall he live. Believest thou this? I walked on the street. A wretched beggar approached me. I forgot who I was and passed by, and then suddenly I remembered, and just as naturally as the hungry begin to eat and the tired sit down, I turned back and handed him something. It is the same with the temptation to quarrel, to insult, to be vain. 3. One cannot voluntarily cease to remain awake, i.e., to fall asleep. Just as little can one voluntarily cease to live. Life is more important than the will, than desire. 4. Receive with thankfulness the enjoyments of the flesh, all that you meet on the way, if they are not sinful. In short, if they do not go against your consciousness, if they do not make it suffer. But use the efforts of your will, your liberty, only to serve God. 4. 1. Oh, not to forget death for a moment, into which at any moment you can fall. If we would only remember that we are not standing upon an even plane, if you think we are standing so, then you are only imagining that those who have gone away have fallen overboard, and you yourself are afraid that you will fall overboard. But that we are rolling on, without stopping, running into each other, getting ahead and being got ahead of, yonder behind the curtain, which hides from us those who are going away, and will hide us from those who remain. If we remember that always, then, how easy and joyous it is to live and roll together, yonder down the same incline, in the power of God, with whom we have been, and in whose power we are now, and will be afterwards, and forever. I have been feeling this very keenly. 2. There is no more convincing proof of the existence of God than the faculty of the soul by which we can transport ourselves into other beings. Out of this faculty flows both love and reason, but neither one nor the other is in us, but they are outside of us, and we only coincide with them. 3. The power to kill oneself is free play given to people. God did not want slaves in this life, but free workers. If you remain in this life, then it means that its conditions are advantageous to you. If advantageous, then work. If you go away from the conditions here, if you kill yourself, then the same thing will be put before you again there. So, there is nowhere to go. It would be good to write the history of what a man lives through in this life who committed suicide in a past life. How, coming up against the same requirements which were placed before him in the other life, he comes to the realization that he must fulfill them. And in this life, he is more intelligent than in the others, remembering the lesson given him. 4. How does it happen that a clever, educated man believes in the nonsensical? Man thinks that which his heart desires. Only if his heart desires the truth, and only if it does, will he think the truth. But if his heart desires earthly pleasures and peace, he will think of that which will bring him earthly pleasures and peace, or still something else. But as it is not an attribute of man to have earthly pleasures and peace, he will think falsely. And to be able to think falsely, he will hypnotize himself. 5. Life is the desire for the good. Everything that lives, lives only because it desires the good. That which does not desire the good does not live. Man, when awakened to a reasoning consciousness, is conscious of life in himself, i.e., of the desire for the good. But since this consciousness is engendered in the separate bodily being of man, since man learns that life is the desire for the good when he is already separated from others by his bodily being, therefore, in the first awakening of man to a reasoning consciousness, it seems to him that life, i.e., the desire for the good which he recognizes in himself, has for its object his separate bodily being. And man begins to live consciously for the good of his separate being, begins to use that reason of his which revealed to him the essence of all life, the desire for the good, in order to secure the good for his own separate being. But the longer a man lives, the more obvious it becomes to him that his purpose is unattainable, and therefore, while he has not yet made clear to himself his error, even before he recognizes by reason the impossibility of the good for a separate personality, man knows by experience and feeling the error of activity which is directed to the good of his own separate personality. And he naturally strives that his life, his desire for the good, be drawn away from his own personality and brought over to other things, to comrades, friends, family, society. This same reason which he desires to use for the attainment of the good for his own separate being shows man that this good is unattainable, that it becomes destroyed by the struggle between the separate beings for the desired good, destroyed by the unpreventable, innumerable disasters and sufferings which threaten man, and above all, by the unavoidable illnesses, sufferings, old age and death which occur in the individual life of man. No matter how man might expand his desire for the good to other beings, he cannot but see that all these separate beings are like him, subject to unavoidable sufferings and death, and therefore they, just as he, cannot have real life by themselves. And it is just this error of men who have awakened to the consciousness of life that the Christian teaching dissipates, in showing to man that as soon as a consciousness of life has awakened in him, i.e., the desire for the good, then his being, his self, is no longer his separate bodily being, but that same consciousness of life, the desire for the good, not for himself, which was born in his separate being. The consciousness, therefore, of the desire for the good is the desire for the good for everything existent. And the desire for the good for everything existent is God. The Christian teaching teaches just this, that his Son, who resembles God, and who was sent by the Father into the world, that the will of the Father be fulfilled in him, lives in man with an awakened consciousness, the conversation with Nicodemus. The Christian teaching reveals to man with an awakened consciousness that the meaning and the aim of his life does not consist, as it seemed to him before, in the acquiring of the greater good for his own separate personality, or for other such personalities like him, no matter how many they are, but only in the fulfillment in this world of the will of the Father who has sent man into the world. It reveals also to man the will of the Father in regard to the Son. The will of the Father, in regard to the Son, is that there should be manifested in this world that desire for the good, which forms the essence of his life, so that man living in this world should wish the good to a greater and greater number of beings, and consequently he should serve them as he serves his own good. 6. 1. That the desire for the good is not God, but only one of his manifestations, one of the sides from which we see God. God in me is manifested by the desire for the good. 2. That this God which is enclosed in man begins to strive to free himself in broadening and enlarging the being in whom he dwells. Then, seeing the impassable limits of this being, he tries to free himself by going outside of this being and embracing other beings. 3. That a reasoning being cannot find room for himself in the life of an individual, and that as soon as he becomes reasoning, he tries to go out of it. 4. That the Christian teaching reveals to man that the essence of his life is not his separate being, but God, which is enclosed in his being. This God, therefore, becomes known to man through reason and love. 5. And above all, that the desire for the good for oneself, love for oneself, could exist in man only up to the time when reason had not yet awakened in him. But as soon as reason had wakened in him, then it became clear to man that the desire for the good for himself, a separate being, was futile, because the good is not realizable for a separate and mortal being. Just as soon as reason appeared, then there became possible only one kind of desire for the desire for the good for all, because with the desire for the good for all, there is no struggle but union, and no death but the transmission of life. God is not love, but in living, unreasoning beings. He is manifested through a love for oneself, and in living, reasoning beings, through love for everything that exists. 1. In order to believe in immortality, one has to live an immortal life here. I.e., to live not towards oneself, but towards God, not for oneself, but for God. Man, in this life, seems to be standing with one foot on a board and the other on the earth. And as soon as his reason has awakened, he sees that that board upon which he was just about to step lies over an abyss, and it not only bends and creaks, but is already falling, and man transfers his weight to that foot which stands on the earth. How not be afraid if one stands on that which bends and creaks and falls, and how be afraid, and of what to be afraid, if you stand on that upon which everything falls, and below which it is impossible to fall?